Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Archival Discourses. And tonight we're going to be finishing the 60-year Caucasian War by Rostislav Fadiev. And people may notice I'm doing the stream a little bit earlier tonight, and that's largely because my friend AI Shire Tori is doing a stream at the usual time I do this, so to avoid sniping him or clashing, that's why I'm doing this earlier. So for those who may have not watched the previous one, so I'm reading the 60-year Caucasian War, published by Antelope Hill. It's a 19th century Russian history book by Rostislav Fadiev, and it's just about the Russian conquest of the Caucasus. So, I was just picking up where I left off last time. It was then that the entire highland Chechen population, community by community, revolted against Muradism. Preventing the movement of our columns, the inhabitants of the Argon region began to expel and slaughter their naibs, clerics, and all Dagestanis, whatever rank they held. One after another, the Chechen tribe sent deputies to General Yevdokimov with a declaration of submission. This movement spread far and wide, even to such tribes that we could not hope to support because of their remoteness and whom, therefore, we had to advise that they wait for a more favourable time. The Chechens were avenging Muradism for the 18 years of oppression that had crushed their willful personality, and with their characteristic ardour, they sincerely extended their hand to us. Of the entire Chechen population, Shamil now had only Ichkeria, which he ruled personally, and the half-Chechen, half-Avar society of the Cherboloi. However, he could no longer be in doubt that these tribes too, at the first appearance of the Russians, would follow the general movement. At the end of October 1858, a vast area of mountains from the Georgian military road to the Sharo-Argon recognised Russian power. A convenient road was developed for free movement of troops along the Shanty-Argon Valley, protected by three fortifications. A headquarters for the Navaginsky Regiment was established in Chatoy. All that remained was to open up the newly required region by longitudinal routes and to put in order the small brigand societies that inhabited its western end. While the actions on the Argon were taking place, General Baron Urevsky crossed the snowy ridge and, passing through the Capuchin society, invaded the inner lands of Ankratol, where Russian arms had never before penetrated. The main forces of Shamil were far away, but the numerous local population, remembering the previous year's devastation of the Dudoy society, having a similar fate for themselves, flocked under the banners of their naibs, fiercely contesting every step of the advancing detachment. The obstacles to our movement in this region, imposed by nature and the persistence of the inhabitants, were extraordinary. Cloudy ridges, bottomless precipices, forests, and stone walls formed an almost impenetrable labyrinth, where every inch of land was a Lesgian fortress. Throughout the entire campaign, our troops had to fight their way forward with open force, crossing wobbling bridges, hanging over the abyss to storm cliffs fenced with rubble. In spite of the stubborn resistance of the Lesgians who defended this terrain, our detachment devastated 7 communities of Ankratol within 5 weeks, destroyed more than 40 stone walls, and took 3 fortifications with artillery. Yet the success of this expedition cost us dearly. At the seizure of the All of Kituri, General Vrevsky and several excellent officers were mortally wounded. Taking charge of the detachment, Colonel Korganov continued the offensive, ravaged the last Didoy Alls, and left on the eastern borders of this community from last year's extermination, and only then descended from the mountains. The double devastation and loss of faith in Shamil, who had suffered defeats all summer, had their effect on the inhabitants of impregnable Lesgistan. Seeing the impossibility of repelling our blows and not daring to submit their land to us, which was the onset of autumn we could not protect, 4,000 Antsuks and Capuchins moved from the mountains to our territory. The movement of Adjutant General Baron Wrangel to Mitchik was, as has already been said, only a demonstration intended to divert Shamil's forces and attention from Chatoy. The time had not yet come for a decisive offensive from Dagestan. In 1858, the Dagestan troops had to perform a lot of unseen but very important work. It was necessary to achieve the goal for which Salatarbia was occupied, the development of routes from Bertunai to Ork and the Kumik Plain. By conquering Salatavia, the troops of the Caspian region and the left flank were connected into one active force, concentrated against the northern side of the mountains. But in order for them to truly unite, it was necessary to establish several roads from Bertunai to the extremities of the country, together with the scattered and hitherto still hostile Salatavian population, and to subdue the Orkovians, who stubbornly held on to their forest farms. The Salatava detachment was busy in the execution of these enterprises throughout the summer of 1858 and all the following winter. Besides the actions in Salatavia, The Dagestan troops had to guard the long frontier line from the Sulak to the Snowy Ridge, with the base in Bertunai. The main forces of the Caspian region were concentrated in the northwestern corner of this country, which made it necessary to weaken the defensive means of Dagestan itself. All the while, no matter how constrained the enemy was, he had greater forces, and the necessity of desperate measures could direct him towards the subdued Dagestan, as it had driven him to the side of Vladikavkaz earlier that year. In the Caspian region, it was necessary to act very cautiously. The main actions that winter, as well as during the previous summer, were to be performed by General Yevdokimov. With the occupation of the Argon region, the troops of the left flank were spread over too vast an area, yet they were responsible for the execution of the most important enterprises. The Commander-in-Chief reinforced the left flank with 8 battalions from the Grenadiers and the 18th Infantry Division. With these reinforcements, General Yevdokimov could divide his forces, leaving a detachment on the Argun. Sufficient to cover the recent conquest in the new Chechen settlements, he concentrated other troops in Galashki, at the western tip of the Chechen-occupied country, near the limits of the Ossetian military district. The Galashki detachment proceeded to develop this remote country, which had hitherto been one hopeless wilderness harbouring brigand villages and fugitives. The troops cleared the glades, but it was impossible for them to overtake the small population of Abreks who hid themselves in the wildest places. To resolve this problem, General Yevdokimov sent 2,000 horsemen from the newly conquered population of Lesser Chechnya into the mountains under the leadership of their Naib. The Chechens scattered into the forest, exterminated the persistent brigands, and forced the others to move to the flatlands. By the end of the year, this part of the region was uncovered and pacified. With General Yevdokimov was within the Ossetian military district, Shamil, his activity increasing with the calamities that befell him, planned a new campaign, hoping to expel us from the newly conquered Argon region. Meanwhile, we had laid the Yevdokimov fortification above the Chateau fortification, which now marked the highest point of our line on the Argun. Beyond it began the spurs of the Snowy Ridge, which blocked any passage for an army at this time of year. Between the Chateau and the Yevdokimov fortifications, the Argun flowed through a rocky fissure of immeasurable depth, wherein the only path connecting the two fortifications curved along the rocky ledges. Shamil positioned a strong force in the foothills of Greater Chechnya, with the aim of attracting our troops to that side, and with another party rushed suddenly to the gorge between the Chateau and Yevdokimov fortifications. He hoped to capture the gorge, cut through our forces stretched along the Argun, and open access to the Trans-Argun region, where rapid movements were impossible for regular troops. At this time of year, he ordered the forces left in Chechnya to rush to the same point at the first report of his success. Shamil's plan was conceived with a true military outlook and could have put us in a difficult position. But the Murids were operating in the midst of a Chechen population that had already broken its moral alliance with them. Their movements could not remain a secret from us. Shamil met our battalions at points he had hoped to capture by surprise and had to abandon his daring enterprise. Ichkeria was the only place left before the entire Chechen nation could be considered subdued. Shamil foresaw where our forces would go and spent a whole year fortifying his capital, Vedino. Not counting on the natives, he summoned assemblies from all Dagestan for the defense of Ichkeria. Before Christmas, General Yevdokimov moved 3 detachments to Ichkeria. The first detachment under his personal leadership entered the Bas River Gorge from Shali, the second under Colonel Bazanov headed for the same river through the mountains from the Argun fortification. Prince Mirsky led the 3rd detachment from the Kumyk Plain through Greater Chechnya. By New Year's Day, the detachments converged on the Bas River. Our troops, as they moved forward, cut down the forest and paved the road. The Dagestanis fought stubbornly, never giving up that foreign land without a fight, but the Ishkarian Chechens resisted only under the eyes of their allies and surrendered as soon as the Dagestanis were forced to retreat from their dwellings. In 3 weeks, up to 1,000 families of this Chechen detachment approached a strong position in the Tauzen Tract, fortified in advance by the enemy. General Yevdokimov sent a column to bypass the blockades on the snow-covered mountains. When its arrival on the ridge above Torzen spread hesitation among the mountaineers, General Kempfert, who approached the position from the front, struck them down in one swift blow. After this affair, the development of the terrain again required considerable effort. Early in February, the Bas Gorge was cleared as far as the All of Alishtanzi, the point from which the road to Vedino emerges from the gorge into the mountains. This part of the country presented to the Highlanders every advantage for a strong defence. General Yevdokimov chose to make his way to Vedino at once, placing his troops in a fortified camp in front of the enemy's fortresses, and then to develop the road to the rear. A special column was sent along the ridges to take a detour flanking the line along which the main forces were to advance. This manoeuvre, executed quickly, opened the way to Vedino. our troops occupied a mountain 2 kilometers from Shamil's fortified residence. Here, the Chechen detachment was to halt under a convenient connection to our borders, opened in the rear of the position. Having knocked down the mountaineers from the surrounding heights, General Yevdokimov fenced his camps with traps and began to build a road back along the route he had taken. The inclement weather made the work extremely difficult. As the troops in front of Vedeno built a fortress gradually rising in the enemy's sight, the road to Bas was washed away several times by rain, not finished and dry until mid-March. Only then, with the arrival of artillery, the Chechen detachment had nothing but mountain guns until then, could the siege begin. Vedeno is situated in a valley at the junction of 2 deep ravines that enclose it from the northern side. Whence our troops arrived. From the east, it is flanked by a chain of hillocks, gradually descending from the ridge. On this chain, a number of closed redoubts were built by the mountaineers. The mountain fortifications consisted of ditches, palisades, dugouts, round bastions, and tall, thick ramparts made of logs, piled with earth as cover for riflemen. Vedeno was occupied by a garrison of 7,000 men under the command of 14 naibs, subordinate to Shamil's son, Ghazi Mohammed. On March 17th and 18th, the first trenches were laid, one on the western side of the fortress, the other against a separate Andean fortification, which blocked the line of redoubts from our side. A special column was placed to interrupt the communication of the enemy garrison with Ichkeria. His only route for retreat was now Andia, which was not blocked by Russian troops so as to not push the resistance of the mountaineers to the extreme. The main forces of the enemy's fortifications were in the line of redoubts surrounding Vedeno from the east. They commanded the fortress itself, so it would be necessary to storm it and remain within it after the assault under their fire. In order to disrupt this line, all we had to do was to position ourselves at the same height, occupying one of the redoubts. In the last days of March, our attack was brought from the western side to the ravine, whence our artillery shelled the foot of the redoubts facing the fortress and tore the enemy garrison into 2 halves without communication. From the east, it moved 60 paces to the Andean redoubt. On April 1st, an assault column under the command of General Kempfert was appointed. At sunset, after a heavy cannonade which covered the Andean redoubt with shells, it was stormed and taken instantly. It happened as General Yevdokimov had intended. The garrison of the neighbouring redoubt, seeing the incomparably superior forces of the assailants near themselves and on the same height, found resistance impossible and retreated to the redoubt lying further away. This retreat was communicated to the whole line, and in 2 hours the redoubts were abandoned by the enemy. From that moment, Shamil's fortress was open to fire from above. The movement of Colonel Chertkov's column along the Kolu Gorge to the only line of retreat remaining for the mountaineers ended the matter. The enemy set fire to the fortress and retreated up the mountain. After the bloody battles of the previous era, which had cost so many thousands of men, the assault that decided the fate of Vedeno cost only 26 men removed from the line. While the siege of Vedeno was in progress, Adjutant General Baron Wrangel entered Ichkeria from the east in order to clear the glades in the very places through which our troops had retreated from Dargo in 1845. New clearings were made on this side. By the beginning of summer, Ichkeria had been uncovered and the population of that country, the Ork and the natives of Greater Chechnya, who had fled from our power in the forest foothills, had been subdued by the ceaseless actions of the Chechen and Thalatava detachments, which scattered their columns in all directions. Greater Chechnya was repopulated by its former inhabitants, gathered in large ools. Perfect safety, even for a solitary traveller, was established throughout the newly conquered region. After the conquest of Vedeno, the considerable Gabelow society, Shamil's last Chechen land, rebelled against his authority without waiting for Russian columns, expelling the Murids and sending a delegation to General Yevdokimov. The entire Chechen nation, down to the last village, was subdued. Dagestan alone was left to Shamil, but as long as Dagestan stood under the banner of Muridism, our dominance in the Caucasus remained as precarious within Chechnya as outside it. In Dagestan lay the spiritual centre of the Muslim revolt. This vast, unapproachable region, unknown at its depths, inhabited by bellicose and viciously fanatical tribes, slavishly submissive to spiritual authority, could defend in its independence without Chechen assistance, as has been proved in previous years. During the Akulgo campaign, even before the Chechen uprising, when we controlled the loyal Avaria and Koisuba in the middle of the mountains, when not all Dagestani tribes stood for Muridism, the main forces of the Caucasian Corps were sent against Shamil from both sides. At that time, the Russian troops had laid down 5,000 men before one village, the destruction of which was the only result of the campaign. Now the whole of Dagestan, organised and furnished with fortresses, obeyed Shamil. The forces of Muridism were much more significant than in 1839. The difference consisted only in our relative position and that of the enemy. But in this difference lay the subsequent fate of the war. The conquest of the 2 preceding years had radically changed the strategic conditions of the offensive on Dagestan and deeply shaken the confidence of the mountain population in the invincibility of their refuges. Until now, we could only penetrate Dagestan from 2 sides, the south and the east. The southern side was protected by a snowy ridge, behind which it was impossible to establish a foothold. The eastern side by a wide defensive strip, where the long war had turned every village into a fortress. Here and there, the advancing troops had to push the mountaineers from the circumference to the centre, into the unexplored depths of the region, too vast to be traversed at once. With every step inland, the forces of the mountaineers increased, and for us, the difficulties of food and communication increased. These conditions had hitherto made only methodical warfare possible in the mountains. With the conquest of the Argun region and Iscaria, we exposed the third side of Dagestan where nothing was prepared for a vigorous defence. Neither the people nor their dwellings. Made our military base near the very depths of the unknown mountains on which the border tribes relied. The experience of the Lesgin campaigns had already shown how weak the resistance of the Highlanders inside Dagestan was. A detachment that stormed 3 alls a day, there would not be enough to besiege one village on the eastern border. At any rate, on the northern side, opened by the recent conquests, the natural defences of Dagestan were no longer stronger than the Lesgin line with the cover of the snowy ridge removed. Moreover, entering Dagestan from the side, we seized the very heart of the region from the first step and pressed the mountaineers from their core, pushing them over our frontier lines and entering the rear of their strongholds. This new strategic position was the consequence and goal of all the previous campaigns. While the conquest of Chechnya was taking place, the troops of the Caspian region were consolidating themselves in Salatavia. By the summer of 1859, the former principle of attacking Dagestan from the sea was already abandoned. Both the left flank and the Dagestan detachment were concentrated in firmly occupied points on one line. Against the northern, newly open sides of the mountains, only the Lesgin line detachment operating from the Georgian side was by necessity a separate mass. The self-confidence of the mountain population, which for so long had been the strength of Muradism, was deeply shaken by recent events. In 1858 and the first months of 1859, all defeats fell on the Tavlins because the Chechen population, which had already had its turn, avoided fighting as much as possible and submitted at the first sign of success on our side. While fighting in foreign land, the Tavlins had learned how firmly the Russian troops held the positions entrusted to their defence. They could not expect anything else for themselves at home. The people's enthusiasm and determination to defend themselves to the death were sustained by the certainty that we could be repulsed. With the fall of this certainty, the energy of the masses weakened. Meanwhile, Shamil remained with his firmly established power, supported by all the sworn members of Muradism, i.e. the entire thinking part of the population emerged from the popular crowd. In fact, Shamil had even more at his disposal. He could deploy many thousands of brave soldiers against us, had faithful and experienced assistants, impregnable fortresses, and considerable material resources. Yet, as the hope of fighting off the Russians waned, every Highlander naturally began to think of himself, of his family, and of his property. There was no doubt that the crowds gathered under the eyes of Shamil or his chief naibs would fight resolutely, but with the weakening of the people's faith and success, these crowds became troops. In certain sense of the word, troops who would no longer fight for every stone. They could be attacked on purely strategic considerations, as in any other war, and the matter could be settled by a rapid invasion. This is clear now, but that June, Dagestan still seemed an impassable backwater. So fresh was the memory of the bloody and futile attempts that had been repeated against the stand for 20 consecutive years that it seemed impossible to end the matter at once. No one doubted it was now possible to break Dagestan, but to break it in several steps, methodically, as it happened in Chechnya, calculating the actions for a certain number of years. Everyone was then convinced of this, positively everyone except one man. Fortunately, that man was the commander-in-chief. The conquest of Dagestan was accomplished in 5 weeks, forever ridding the Caucasus of the Muradism that had been gnawing at its insides like a cancer. And just as sort of an aside to that, I often find that's the way with war. Often find it's always drawn out and there's a lot of back and forth between both sides. However, once an enemy's resistance is thoroughly broken, the collapse of their forces is pretty swift, and then you get a pretty quick resolution from that point. Funny how it always turns out the way, isn't it? The general offensive was supposed to begin on all sides simultaneously. In the first days of July, the main Chechen detachment of 14,000 men, under the personal command of Count Yevdokimov, was concentrated near Vedeno. Colonel Kaufmann's smaller detachment on the left flank was preparing to march from Shatoy. The main detachment in the Caspian region, the Salatava detachment, consisting of about 9,000 to be further reinforced afterward, assembled at Bertinai. All these troops, amounting to about 25,000 bayonets and horses, were appointed to make an attack from the northern side of the mountains. The eastern side of Dagestan, facing the Caspian Sea, was guarded by a detachment of 5 battalions stationed at Terchadag under the command of General Prince Tarkhanov, ready now to take the offensive. About 2,000 men were also ready to move from Timir Khan's Shura, if necessary, into the gap between the Salatava and the Terchadag detachments. These 3 detachments were at the disposal of Adjutant General Baron Wrangel, who was attached to the Salatava detachment. A detachment of 7,000 men was concentrated on the Lesgian line under the command of General Prince Melikov, flanked by 2 small detachments on the side of the fortress of Novi Zakatal and Tusheti, led by the Princes Shalikov and Cholokashvili. The whole mass of troops, assembled with the greatest efforts to advance into the mountains on 3 sides, did not exceed 40,000 armed men out of the 240,000 that made up the Caucasian army in those months, out of 160,000 if you do not count the troops of the right flank and of the Governor-General of Kutusai. This is a striking example of the localization, one might say, absorption of the troops for the needs of the minor defence, and the occupation of the region, which was a consequence of the Caucasian War. The actions of the 3 detachments, the Chechen, Dagestan, and Lesgin detachments, flanked by secondary columns dependent on them, was subordinated to one general plan, but each commander was independent in his military theatre and guided by local considerations to achieve his objectives. The greatest strength for the enemy's defence consisted of the Andi-Koisu line, which covered the unruly mountains from the north. Firmly fortified and occupied by numerous clusters of mountaineers, this line stopped the advance of the Chechen and Dagestani detachments almost from their first step into the mountains. The Lesgin detachment, operating from the southern side, was somewhat in the rear of this line. In accordance with Prince Boyatynsky's plan, the detachments were to converge against the middle course of the Andi-Koisu River, destroying the defensive line of the mountaineers with the combined efforts. The main, though passive role in the general offensive belonged to the Chechen detachment, which pressed again the most impregnable section of the enemy line. The commander-in-chief himself had come to these troops to be at the centre of the action. The Chechen detachment, the largest of the 3, took the shortest route to the middle reaches of the Andi-Koisu. After some time, when the other columns delved deeper into the mountains, it was to become a connecting and supporting mass for all the advancing troops. The presence of the commander-in-chief and the very destination of the Chechen detachment into the heart of the unruly land caused the Muirs to give all their attention to this part of our forces. Anticipating a decisive blow from it, they coordinated their actions with its actions. Moving slowly without revealing his intentions, the commander-in-chief confused Shamil and forced him to keep his forces together. This made it easier for the flank detachments to deliver a sudden blow to the mountaineers. It was enough for one of them to reach the right bank of the Andi-Koisu to overthrow the whole defensive system of the enemy. It was anticipated that the Dagestan detachment would play the active role. It advanced alongside the Chechen detachment, with both sides enjoying equal success. The enemy had fewer forces stationed downstream than in the middle part of the Koisu. Across the river, opposite the Gumbet mountain, lay Koisubu and Avaria, societies that had stood firmly with us in 1843 and suffered a long persecution from Shamil. Having broken across the river in the lower part of its course, we were entering directly into this region, the only place in Dagestan where we could count on an amiable reception. With the uprising of Avaria and Dagestan, the same decomposition that delivered in Chechnya to us was expected to begin. In any case, with or without Avaria's assistance, once the Dagestan detachment had broken across the river, it was only necessary for it to extend its right flank up the riverbank to take the fortifications piled up by the mountaineers against Teknutsul in the rear. Then the Chechen detachment could freely cross the Koisu and lend a hand to the Lesgin detachment, which until then had been separated as if by an abyss from the forces operating in the north. However, if the Dagestan detachment met insurmountable obstacles from its side, in this extreme case the Lesgin detachment could penetrate deep into the mountains and reach the rear of the enemy line, though with much greater risk and considerable expense of time. In any case, one or the other had to bypass Shamil and the seize the crossing of the Koisu. Then all 3 detachments would connect in the heart of the mountains and the outcome of the struggle would become certain. All that remained was to pursue Shamil quickly, not allowing him to establish himself in any part of the region. The plan was for the Chechen detachment to act methodically at the beginning of the campaign, developing the road from Vedeno to Andia, for the Lesgin detachment to continue the system to which it had already adhered for 2 years, to ravage the enemy's territory, moving little by little into the interior of the mountains, and for the Dagestan detachment alone to make a decisive offensive in the very first step. As Count Yevdokimov had been entrusted with the execution of the commander-in-chief's plans of methodical warfare, so now Baron Wrangel was entrusted with the task of inflicting swift and final blows on Muridism. The northern side of Dagestan, on which the combined forces of the left flank and the pre-Caspian region were advancing, is enclosed by an extremely high, though not snow-capped ridge, which stretches in a continuous wall to the northeast from the Kevsereti to Salatavia, separating the Chechen population from the Tavlin. Beyond the ridge, at a distance of 15 to 20 kilometers, the Andi-Koisu flows in the deepest abyss. There are no gorges across the ridge. One has to climb to its summit and then descend again into the terrible depths. The river can be crossed only in the few places where there are paths leading to the riverbed at an oblique angle along steep cliffs. The long strip between the ridge and the river is cut into several separate cells by the buttresses of the ridge, which reach the very bank of the Koisi. Shamil arranged the defence of this country with a perceptive military eye. The troops of the left flank and the pre-Caspian region were to advance separately, each supported by their own military and food base, one in the recently conquered Ichkeria, the other in Salatavia. Before the Chechen detachment lay Andia, before the Dagestani gumbets separated by a high buttress, through which only two routes connected the lands, the upper with the so-called Andia gates and the lower over the river. Shamil fortified the right bank of the Koisu and the buttress perpendicular to the river. Opposite the Teknutsul Valley, near the village of Konhidat, where the Chechen detachment was to descend, the mountaineers built a whole system of fortifications, stone walls with loopholes and batteries, 8 kilometers long. It was almost impossible to take these fortifications by force, with the raging river serving as a natural moat. Further, at a considerable distance, the Koisu is impassable due to the terrain itself. Opposite Gumbet, along the path of the Dagestan detachment's advance, Shamil fortified the Sogrit Bridge with armoured galleries hidden in the rocks and inaccessible from any side, even for artillery fire. He left bridges across the Koisu only in places inaccessible to us, enclosing them with rubble. On the rest of the stream, not only were the bridges removed, but even the rocks above the river were broken off. The upper route connecting Andia and Teknutsul with Gumbet were blocked by towers and debris in the Andia gate and on the neighbouring paths. On the lower path, where the buttress rests on the river, Shamil fortified the Litli mountain and positioned himself on it with the main forces. The entire population of Andia, Teknutsul and Gumbit were forced to move their families and livestock to the other side of the river and burn their alls. With these defences, all strategic advantages belonged to the mountaineers. From the first step into the enemy's land, the Dagestan and Chechen detachments were separated by the buttress occupied by the mountaineers, and faced an almost insurmountable obstacle, the Andi-Koisu. Meanwhile, the enemy could refuse to fight whenever he wanted. Locking himself in his fortifications, he could also direct the whole mass of his forces against the separated detachments or the columns that were sending out, without any fear for the rear and flanks. The military theatre lying in front of our detachments was a chessboard in which all the borders between the squares were occupied by the enemy, with only one advantage, the tactical superiority of our troops. If it was possible to find an opportunity somewhere to exploit this advantage and break through the enemy's defensive network at a single point, the matter was won because the Highlanders could not regain their lost advantage through open combat. The forthcoming actions were planned with this in mind. By July 1st, the head of the General Staff, the chiefs of the Army Special Arms, and the field staff were gathered in the fortress of Grozny. On July 4th, the Commander-in-Chief arrived to the troops directly from St. Petersburg, where he had gone for a short time. A few days later, the offensive began. On July the 14th, the main Chechen detachment left Vedino and encamped near Lake Yanium. For 2 days in succession, the Commander-in-Chief conducted reconnaissance to the Andean side. On the 17th, the detachment moved to Lake Retlo. On the 18th, extensive reconnaissance was conducted again. At this time, Shamil was burning Andean and Teknutsul villages. On the 22nd, the Chechen detachment advanced and encamped on the edge of the Andean ridge above the Teknutsul valley. At every stop, the troops developed a road for wheeled vehicles through the mountains. Shamil tensely followed the actions of the main detachment from his fortified position. Meanwhile, the fate of the first half of the campaign was already decided at another location. Adjutant Baron Wrangel took up a position near Mitchik on the northern foot of the Gumbit Ridge in the first days of July. Having received here the Commander-in-Chief's latest instructions, he moved forward on the same day as the Chechen detachment, July 14th. Behind the ridge in the path of the detachment, the mountaineers occupied Argwani, a strong ul, the capture of which in 1839 had cost us 800 men, but the Dagestan detachment, having reached the last peaks of the ridge, headed along the spur overlooking the rear of the village. The mountaineers had to abandon this position without a fight. From the heights near Argwani, the position of at least half of Shimil's force hordes were revealed. They were crowded together at the Andy gates and all along the buttress, apparently expecting that the Dagestan detachment would forcefully open communications with the Chechen ones. No one was visible across the river. Owning several bridges, the mountaineers could cross from one bank to the other without hindrance. so they'd not bothered to occupy the opposite side beforehand. Not wasting a minute, Baron Wrangel took advantage of this blunder. In spite of the extreme fatigue of the troops after the strenuous trek through the mountains, Baron Wrangel immediately moved a column under the commander General Rakusa to the Sogwitlock Bridge, knowing that his soldiers would always have strength when there was a crucial task before them. These troops found the bridge removed and the surrounding terrain such that the river could only be approached with proper operations under deadly enemy fire. Consequently, they could not cross the river immediately. But on the next morning, a place was found a kilometre downstream to which the Highlanders had not paid attention, and where it was possible, though with the greatest difficulty, to make a bridge. On both sides, the banks were totally sheer, making it impossible to go down to the water. Arriving at the advanced position, General Wrangel decided to cross at this point. The troops occupied the heights of the left bank and immediately covered them with obstructions for riflemen and artillery, before the enemy could occupy the opposite side with considerable force. From that moment, we controlled the crossing. Our fire covered the other bank to such an extent that when the late hordes of mountaineers arrived at Sogwitlock with their guns, they could neither descend to the river nor build blockades against us, nor strike at the head of the crossing column. Their action was limited to shelling the camp and the crossing from the surrounding mountains. The only thing left to do was to control the raging river, but this was the most difficult part of the affair. All the material means for the crossing brought on the soldiers' backs consisted of ropes and a few planks. For 2 days, the work proved futile. A few men crossing the cradle conveyed over the abyss on a rope and encamped in the cave on the opposite bank, slaughtering the Murids who defended it. But it would be impossible to ferry the entire detachment by rope, and meanwhile the Highland hordes were increasing by the hour until they covered all the surrounding mountains. It was only on the third day that a shaky rope plate 15 fathoms long and a few kilometres wide was thrown across the Caucasus, on which the men could cross one by one. At daybreak, several companies converged on the upper bank and boldly marched to the rear of the galleries enclosing the Sogwitlock Bridge. Despite the extreme numerical superiority, the mountaineers avoided open combat and retreated to the mountains. A permanent bridge was immediately built at Sogwitlock, where the cliffs above the river nearly meet. To open access to Avaria, the only thing left to do was to take the Ashkent mountain, which rises steeply above the river and was already summoned by blockades. On July 21st, as soon as the communication between the two banks was firmly established, Baron Wrangel advanced an assault column under the commander General Rakusa. The troops had to climb up a winding path to two enormously high escarpments and through a dense forest, then climb to the top of a steep stone ridge from which a series of high mountain glades stretched all the way to Avaria. The troops moved before dawn, climbing the first ledge and knocking the enemy back from below. Finally breaking through the forest, but here they saw strong blockades with loopholes and bastions before them, which could not be approached except by slowly climbing the slope under heavy enemy fire. The success of the assault was doubtful, and the loss would inevitably be great. With the swiftness and self-confidence that distinguished the Caucasian soldier, the battalions turned to the right and climbed straight up the ridge they were passing under. Soldiers climbed up the abrupt cliff, pushing each other up, clinging to the crevices and plants sprouting in the rock, under a hail of stones thrown on their heads. In an hour, the front battalions were already on the top. The mountaineers fled from the bypass blockades. The same evening, the Dagestan detachment conquered the village of Satank, fortification once stood, taken by Shamil in 1843. On July 22nd, the entire Dagestan detachment camped on the mountains near the village of Ashkent. When the troops were pitching tents, the Sultanians came to the camp to ask for help against a party of Murids threatening them. The party turned out to be a delegation from all the Avar villages sent to Baron Wrangel. The Avars said, "We have been gnawing on Shamil's irons for 16 years, waiting for you to give us a hand. Now the end of his kingdom has come." And another aside I'm going to make is ultimately what seems to mean the Russians were successful against the Shamil and the Circassians is they were able to break off many of these other tribes of the Caucasus that had been loyal to Shamil up until that point. And so by defecting to the Russians, they effectively left Shamil without allies. While Baron Wrangel was advancing from the Andi-Koisu, the troops gathered in the Timir Khan Shura, having united with the Terchidag detachment under General Manyukin, ascended to the ridge enclosing the Koisu Buli society from the eastern side, and destroyed the mountain fortification of the Burundluk Kale. When the 22nd, the Koisu Bulians ceased to resist, the frontier fortress of the Ulikale opened its gates to us. General Manyukin garrisoned this fortress as well as many points on the way, and began to build a crossing across the Avar Koisu to open a direct communication between Baron Wrangel and Timir Khan Shura. In a few days, Avaria and Koisubu were brought under Russian control. Together with this peaceable population, the most hostile, the Gumbit population, which had been steadfastly in favour of Muradism since the day of its appearance in the Caucasus, was subdued. In Koisubu and Gumbit, the popular government, which had been suppressed by Muradism, was restored. Rulership over Avaria, by prior permission of the Tsar, was given to Ibrahim Khan Matuli, the nearest relative of the extinct house of the Avars. The subjugated inhabitants immediately set up a militia against the Murids. In addition, with the conquest of the northwestern part of the mountains, the Dagestan detachment could have local means of transportation, which the inhabitants willingly offered, thus greatly alleviating the main difficulty of mountain warfare. Food for the troops, local transport could move stores of provisions wherever they were needed without requiring any cover. With this aid quickly and skillfully organised, the Dagestan detachment gained mobility that could not have been dreamed of before. The impassable terrain of the mountains opened up for them. With the occupation of Koisubu and Avaria, the defensive line of the mountaineers fell by itself. The Dagestan detachment could come to its rear in 2 marches. On July the 18th, Shamil galloped from Kilitlin Mountain to Sogritlok to verify whether the Russians were in fact crossing Koisu, and saw with his own eyes our battalions on the right bank. From that moment, the Murid leader went left with 2 options: either lock himself in the blockades of the Kilitlin Mountain, from which he had no way out, but where he could not be easily taken, or clear the banks of the Koisu and retreat with his entire army to Karata, which had become the capital of the mountains after the fall of Edino. Before the crowd around him became more disorderly, under the eyes of the Imam, the mountaineers would not lay down their arms. Shamil could prolong his rule over the people for some time, but both options only showed Muradism's impotence before Russian arms. The news of the Avar and Koisubu submissions spread quickly over the mountains and aroused feelings that had long simmered in the hearts of the people. Everyone began to think about his personal safety, refusing to sacrifice for a cause that was so clearly lost. The authorities established by Muradism had lost all significance in the eyes of the crowd. The People's Party, which had been silent for 30 years against a spiritual deposition, suddenly stepped forward and took the upper hand. The political power of Muradism collapsed in 3 days. From that moment on, the Russian camps were filled with former Highland leaders and people's delegations. Significant men were hurrying over each other to declare their loyalty to the new power in the hope of preserving the position they had acquired. Communities were hurrying to submit to rid themselves of the pogrom and subversion of the former chiefs who had flown to the victor's headquarters. All those who had any status rushed to the nearest available power, to the commander-in-chief, Baron Wrangel or Prince Melikov. Not much dignity and character was shown in this change by the men who for 30 years had amazed Russia with their unending firmness, but such phenomena are no longer usual in social upheavals of history, neither in Europe nor Asia. When Shamil, after several days of hesitation, finally decided to retreat to Karata, the crowds he assembled no longer recognised any authority. People belonging to the subdued societies were the first to abandon the posts entrusted to them and return home. Their example inspired others. Shamil had just moved down from Kilitlin Mountain, entrusting the defence of the fortress to one of the naibs, and the garrison occupying it looted the stores of provisions and scattered. From the several thousand mountaineers occupying the bank of the Koisu, only a few dozen now followed Shamil. The Karata people, despite their fortified terrain, refused to defend themselves. All means of resistance ran out for Shamil at once. Seeing his cause finally lost in northern Dagestan, he decided to rush to the southeast, to that belt of fortresses and the militant population against which all Russian efforts had so far collapsed. The far-sighted Imam had long ago prepared a refuge in this region. On the impregnable mountain Gunib having appeared in Andalal, Shamil could hope to keep in obedience the numerous and fanatical population of this country, and if not to recover, at least to prolong affairs for an indefinite period of time. Andalal is enclosed by nature on all sides, on the south by snowy mountains, on the east and north by bottomless abysses in which 3 branches of the Koisu flow. The population of this part of the mountains is grouped in huge stone walls, each of which can withstand a proper siege. Having established himself in the middle of the Andalal on the Gunib mountain, an impregnable position with excellent defences, Shamil could maintain the determination of the surrounding population, attract throngs of fanatics and loyalists from all the mountains to Andalal, and put up a resistance against which we would be powerless to break with any immediacy. The remnants of Muradism had only to keep their weapons in hand until the winter came. Our troops could not have continued the march through the snow-covered mountains because it was impossible to feed the horses, and Shamil would have remained face-to-face with the population that had trembled before his name for 25 years. In Andalal, the outcome of the war was to be decided. The conquest of Avaria reverberated in this region as it did in the others. A party hostile to Shamil came forward at once, headed by one of the founders of Muridism, who spent a year fighting Shamil for supreme power, the famous Kibit Magoma. Deprived of official importance but extremely influential in the mountains, this man attracted the population of Tibitlil, one of the main Andalal owls, and sent him a deputation to the General Wrangle. The advocates of Muridism were, however, still strong in Andalal, and the other owls remained silent. The outcome of the matter depended on which party would prevail there. Having received the deputation of Kibit Magoma, Baron Wrangle immediately removed Prince Tarkanov, who stood on the eastern frontier of Dagestan, to the border of Andalal. However, after occupying so many points, there were very few men left in Turchidag detachment. Prince Tarkanov, known for his decisiveness, moved directly to Chok, one of the main storage strongholds of Shamil, agitated the population of the Ul, forced the Murids to flee from the fortress, and brought the Russian garrison into it. Despite this success, Chok absorbed the loss of his forces. He had nothing to proceed with. The other troops of the Dagestan detachment were scattered by a rapid invasion of Gumbet, Khoisu, and Avaria. Its right columns extended to Karat, to open communication with the Chechen detachment. Meanwhile, Shamil rode away from Karata to Andalal with a few adherents. He was robbed twice on the road and driven back to the forest by Kibit Magoma's men, but he managed to reach Gunib. The presence of the Imam on the impregnable Gunib in the middle of Andalal, where the main Urs had yet not shown obedience, again confused the matter and demanded the quickest measures. Communication between the Dagestan and Chechen detachments via Karati was opened on July 27th. 3 days later, Adjutant General Baron Wrangle arrived in the main detachment. From both sides, the way deep into the mountains was open. The Commander-in-Chief decided to move all available forces on Andalal immediately to suppress the adherents of the Imam in this region before they had time to unite, and to surround Gunib closely, locking Shamil and the last of his Murids within. With our forces in sight, the party of Kibit Magoma should have gained the upper hand in Andalal, but everything depended on the speed of action. The Commander-in-Chief was confident that the newly subjugated population was pacified and could not, after such an abrupt change, again turn to the hostile camp in a few days. Relying on their energy, if not the loyalty of the crowd, Prince Boyatinski moved all the columns scattered across Avaria, Gumbet, Khoisubu, and Kars-Kois to Andalal, leaving only a few companies in the newly conquered mountains to cover bridges and provision depots. The Chechen detachment sent the column through the Karata. The main difficulty with this unforeseen concentration of troops in the southwestern corner of the mountains was their food and supply. The provisions for the Dagestan troops were in Salatavia. Nothing was stocked within Andalal's borders. Emergency measures were taken immediately. Their energetic execution by the Chief of Staff of the pre-Caspian region, Prince Mirsky, allowed the military operation to develop without the slightest loss of time. Local means found in the mountains. Chervodar transport and regimental bundles gathered by troops in Andalal were fed day by day through the ridges of Gumbet, Khoisubu, and Avaria. Meanwhile, convoys formed abruptly in subdued Dagestan, carried the provision stocks in the mountains to the nearest points from where, after the first days, the Andalal detachment would already have been adequately supplied. With the entry of a considerable force into Andalal, the party hostile to Shamil immediately triumphed. The whole country and the surrounding mountain societies expressed obedience to Baron Wrangle. Our troops closely encircled Shamil, who had encamped with a few hundred desperate men on the inaccessible summit of Gunib. Having dispatched Adjutant General Wrangle to Andalal, the Commander-in-Chief descended with a Chechen detachment into Teknutsal Valley on August 4th and set up a camp on the Andi Khoisi, near the village of Kontikatel, by the abandoned mountain fortifications. The next day, General Prince Melikov, commander of the Lesghian line, arrived at the Konk-Hirdatel camp with his cavalry. But while the aforementioned events were taking place in the northern and western Dagestan, a Lesghian detachment was advancing on the countries lying along the headquarters of the Andi Khoisu and the barely passable mountains. Prince Melikov embarked on the campaign earlier than the other detachments. Having pulled the bulk of his troops together at the foot of the Pokhalas Tavi mountain on July 6th, he started on the ridge, dividing the Didoy and Capuchin societies, setting up a wagon fort here and developing the road to the Ilan-Kevi villages. At the same time, the side columns came out on the mountains at the two ends of the Lesghian line. The Tushin column in the upper gorge of the Andi Khoisu and the Zakatel column against the headwaters of the Avar Khoisu. Leaving any dead weight in the Wagenburg, Prince Melikov moved to the Besho Ridge and undertook from there a number of operations against the Lesghian societies. He ravaged one by one the village of Kituri, which had cost the life of General Vrevsky the previous year, the villages in the upper reaches of the Didoy tributaries of the Khoisu, and the large Ul Kupro, which had been rebuilt after the defeat of 1857. In the meantime, the Ticino detachment brought the inhabitants of the upper gorge of Antiquoisu to submission and advancing through the Dudoi society and devastating all which lay in their way, joined Prince Melikov. Seeing no end to the devastation, many Lesgian villages began to surrender their properties. At this time, the movement that started in Avaria spilled over the mountains. Elected and significant people from all surrounding societies flocked to the camp of Lesgian detachment. In a matter of days, the Didoi, Ilan Kevi, Tyndall, and Kavar societies were subdued. At the beginning of August, fulfilling the commander-in-chief's plan, Prince Melikov undertook a bold movement towards Tekhnutsul through the snowy spurs of the Bokovoy range, reaching the depths of the region which had never before laid eyes on Russians. This campaign was accomplished with particular speed and precision. The Lesgian detachment reached the village of Tinti above the Antikoisi. From there, Prince Melikov continued his march with nothing but cavalry and came to Konkidatul, passing between the Chechen society of Jamalal and the Lesgian Bogulatsi, which Shamil had nicknamed his Siberia. Thus, the unruly region was traversed in all directions. The three detachments that entered the mountains from different directions, northwest, northeast, and south, came into contact, as it was intended, in the middle part of the Andikoisu, relying on the central mass of the Chechen detachment. On his return from Kondikdatul, Prince Melikov was to remove his detachment from the upper reaches of the Andikoisu to the headwaters of the Avar, bringing the southern Lesgian communities into submission, occupying Irib, considered the main centre of all the Lesgian region, and arrive at Gunib, where the commander-in-chief had appointed him a new rendezvous. As in the first half of the campaign, the operational lines of all active forces had to intersect at one point, determining the general direction of the campaign. Now, this point was moved from the middle of the Antikoisu to the southern eastern end of the mountains in Andalau. Having laid a bridge fortification named the Preobrazinski at the site of the camp, the commander-in-chief left on the August 10th under cover of a small convoy. To the troops concentrated in Andalau via Koisubu and Avaria, the Chechen detachment remained in Andia under Commander General Kempfer to complete the undertaken work. The journey of the victor of the Caucasus through the conquered region had the character of a triumphal procession. He was greeted with speeches and addresses. Salutes rang through the halls, countless crowds flocked to look at him. Prince Boyatinsky rode through Avaria, which had been conquered only a fortnight before, not at the head of the troops, but as governor. With one convoy of 100, sometimes he was accompanied only by the locals. The mountaineers realised now that the war was truly over. On August 18th, the commander-in-chief circled the Gunid mountain and arrived at Kegir, the main headquarters of the Dagestan detachment. From there it was possible to see the whole of the Gunid mountain rising to the east, behind the Karu Koisu cliff. Gunib, aptly nicknamed the Guitar Mountain by the soldiers, indeed has the necklace outline of this instrument, sloping from east to west toward the left bank of the Karakoisu. It stands secluded among a cluster of surrounding mountains dominating them. The slopes of Gunib are extremely steep, more than 45 degrees, and rise for a kilometre or more, ending with a sheer stone belt several dozen fathoms high, which surrounds the entire 100 square kilometre area of the upper mountain. This belt is also raised above the inner wall, so that the very surface of the mountains forms a cup. At the foot of Gunib, the circumference of the mountain is about 60 kilometres. From the highest eastern edge of the mountain, a small river flows down the slope and then cascades into the Koisi. On Gunib, there is an all and several farms, mills, birch groves, pastures, and arable fields, everything necessary to sustain human life. There is only one path leading to the mountain from the shore of the Karakoisu, obscured for some distance by steep cliffs. Shamil blocked this area with a high wall full of loopholes. On the northern side, the crown of rocks terminating the steep cliff slides slightly one place, leaving a narrow passage. The mountaineers barricaded it with debris, although there is no road there at all. On the other sides of the rocky belt, there were a few rain-washed gullies, over which the brave hunters have climbed with the helm of a rope. But these passages appear quite inaccessible. If Shamil was capable of amassing sufficient force to occupy the entire upper circumference of Gunib, Riflemen, requiring at least 1,500 men, this mountain would be truly impregnable. However, Shamil had only 400 guns, including the population of the Ul and the 3 cannons. Yet even with such meagre forces, the Gunib position was extremely strong. Looking at the mountain, one could not find a good side to approach it from. Shamil had only 3 or 4 men with him who were notable for their former positions. He brought with him to Gunib a small number of the domestic Murids, a few desperate Abreks and a few brutal followers of the Tarakat, and 100 fugitive soldiers, so burdened with crimes that they dared not take advantage of the forgiveness granted to them and turn themselves in alongside their comrades. The state created by Muridism, which had fought against the Russian Empire for 30 years, began with a handful of fanatics and ended with a gang of brigands. Even before the arrival of the commander-in-chief, Baron Wrangel had tightly encircled Gunib. All the paths leading to the floor of the mountain from the halls below were occupied by several columns. On the eastern side, facing the interior of the mountain, the blockade was entrusted to Colonel Radetzky, the southeastern corner and the whole southern side to Colonel Gukasov, the bank of the Koisu to General Kononovich, and the northern side to General Prince Tarkanov. The Murids who had encamped on the mountain were hopelessly locked in. On August 17th, Shamil sent representatives to Baron Wrangel with an offer of ceasefire. The proposal was accepted. Upon the arrival of the commander-in-chief at the Kega camp, negotiations of the surrender began immediately but led to nothing. Despite the most generous terms announced to Shamil and a complete security promised to his men, the older leader of Muridism obviously was wavering between his lifelong conviction, which compelled him to fight against the infidels of his last breath, and his attachment to his large family who were with him at Gunib. Besides, having grown up in implacable enmity to the Russians, did not yet fully trust our promises. Shamil's final words, which concluded the negotiations, were, "Gunib is a high mountain. I am sitting on it. Above me, even higher, is a god. The Russians are standing below. Let them storm it." As the negotiations took place, General Prince Melikov arrived at the Kaja camp and performed the movement he had been ordered to carry out. The Lezgin detachment went deep into the mountains from the upper reaches of the Andi-Koisu to the right bank of the Kara-Koisu, brought to the submission the rest of the tribes of Lezgistan, which everywhere met our troops with cordiality, occupied Irib and destroyed the fortifications of this all. The eastern mountains were conquered down to the last village, excepting Gunib, on which the final remnants of Muridism were united. On August 23rd, the attack on Gunib was entrusted under the chief command of Adjutant General Baron Wrangel to General Kessler, Chief of Engineers of the Caucasian Army. On the 24th, General Tarkanov's column took the gardens lying on the northern side of Gunib and positioned itself at the foot of the mountain. Colonel Kononovich's column came up from the Koisi riverbed and laid riflemen on the first edge of the bank. On the night of the 24th, it was proposed to arrange bunkers for these two columns partway up the mountain, but the troops, once thrown into battle, went on and on. While ascending the road, Colonel Kononovich met with the strongest resistance and had to halt. At the same time, Colonel Gukasov, who stood against the southeastern corner of Gunib, having looked out beforehand for a large breach in the rocky belt crowning the mountain, rushed to it at dawn and by means of ropes and ladders ascended to the upper plain. Prince Tarkanov feigned an attack during the night, which forced the Murids to throw down the piles of stones they had prepared. For 2 hours, the mountain rumbled under leaping fragments of rock. When this rain of stone was over, Prince Tarkanov moved his columns upward to the breach, where the rocks of the ledge had been pushed apart, swept away the enemy's rubble, and stood on the mountain. Our troops now occupied the two opposite corners of Gunib. Most of the mountain's defenders were exterminated or taken. Shamil and the rest locked themselves in the all of which all three columns were converging. At noon, the commander-in-chief arrived at Gunib and demanded Shamil's immediate surrender. 14 battalions stood tightly around the small all occupied by 100 Murids. The remnant of the enemy had no opportunity either to leave or to fight back. After 2 hours of hesitation, the old Imam left the all and surrendered to the will of the victor. The year, day, and hour of the end of the Caucasian War are carved in the birch grove on the stone where Prince Vyatinsky sat and accepted the captive Shamil. 1859, August 25th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Shamil was taken exactly 3 years later to the day from Prince Vyatinsky's appointment as Commander-in-Chief, August 25th, 1856. Prince Vyatinsky informed the army about what had transpired in 2 consecutive orders. The first order was given on August 22nd. Warriors of the Caucasus, on the day of my arrival in the region, I summoned you to gain great glory for our sovereign, and you have fulfilled my hope. In 3 years, you have conquered the Caucasus from the Caspian Sea to the Georgia military road. May my loud thank you resound and pass through the defeated mountains of the Caucasus, and may it penetrate with all the power of my soulful expression to your hearts. The second order was issued on August 26th. Shamil is taken. I congratulate the Caucasian army. During the leadership of Prince Vyatinsky before his personal campaign, 8 guns were taken from the mountaineers. During the final conquest of the mountains, 52 guns were taken, totaling 60 guns in all. Our prisoners were released, more than 2,000 of both sexes. Yeah, and that's the end of the main part of the book. And there is a short conclusion section. How long is this? Yeah, it's about 8 or 9 pages. Okay, I'll read them and finish up with this conclusion, and then we'll wrap the stream up. The eastern mountains are conquered forever. Such a phenomenon as muridism is not repeated twice in the lifetime of a nation, but even muridism, which expresses the ultimate degree of fanaticism of the most fanatical belief, which turned man himself into a passion, and which grew up on the most favourable soil that could be found in the world, united the mountaineers against us only because of circumstances that were absolutely exceptional. When the preaching of the Tarakat began in the Caucasus, the depth of the mountains was still unknown and almost inaccessible. Everything that took place there was hidden from our eyes. Without taking a good look at the character of the newly acquired region, the Russian authorities started operating with a faulty system, dismantling the original public institutions and scrapping the traditional systems which grew from the local soil and made every tribe cherish its independence with its own hands. The Russian authorities broke the dams which muridism would have struggled to breach. Then, for the convenience of external administration, they began to introduce Sharia law everywhere, surrendering the mountain population to the boundless influence of a doctrine hostile to us. As soon as muridism, then still a small sect, had taken refuge in the mountains, the efforts of the Caucasian Corps were diverted to another direction, and for several years the advocates of the corrective Tarakat enjoyed complete freedom in the eastern Caucasus. The Highlanders of the 1830s had been prepared for centuries for the spiritual conflagration that suddenly engulfed the Caucasus. These richly gifted people lived only by immediate impressions, waiting for the first idea that would penetrate their minds. In the Caucasian mountaineers, the properties of the two races that they delineated merge. With the passionate impressionability of the Asiatics, they combine the energy, independence of personability, and the enterprise of the Europeans, which so sharply distinguish them from their related co-religionists who lived behind them to the very edge of the Asian continent. For the mountaineers, muridism appealed to both sides of their nature, creating for them an ideal life that required no moral effort on the part of man, consisting of battles, adventures, dangers, and plunder, crowned with paradise. As long as it was necessary only to act, the mountaineers flocked under the banners of the Imam with unparalleled zeal. But when muridism began to organise their life on the basis of Sharia and impose religious guardianship on them, they turned against it. Left to themselves, eye to eye with the Sharia, the mountaineers could not stand the Muslim character. In a few days, the religious dimension of muridism would disappear from popular memory. Only a legend would remain about it as a great struggle of the Caucasian tribes against the Russians. Now, with the fall of muridism, the mountain population is again broken up into separate tribes. The ancient folk institutions, already partly restored, with adaptations made to accommodate the needs of the Russian power, will eventually be made clear and formally legalized. The Eastern Caucasus, divided into two large regions, the left flank and the pre-Caspian region, is subdivided into 11 districts. In each district, there should be a court and justice according to custom, made up of the people's elders and elected officials. The societies that make up the districts are governed by naibs, chosen from honourable locals who are loyal to us. This way of governing, first established in Chechnya by Prince Boyatynsky during his command of the left flank, was justified by long experience. The newly subjugated Chechens stood firmly with us even in the face of a struggle that remained uncertain. Their country was relatively safe, while it was impossible to pass without an armed escort with the lands of other societies that had already been subjugated for half a century. In the Caucasus, popular self-government based on clearly defined rights, the elimination of a spiritual influence, preserves the tranquility of the region better than thousands of bayonets. As the shots were silenced in different parts of the Caucasus, the brave but hungry population of the mountains laid down their guns and eagerly began peaceful labour. With the development of the people's welfare, new social needs not satisfied by ancient custom will surely arise, and will themselves cause the gradual introduction of enlightened legislation. The interior of the mountains is being actively opened by convenient roads. For the last 3 years, our troops have been moving forward with nothing but a shovel and an axe in their hands. Where they have passed, it is now possible to travel on wheels along that were once mountain paths. Roads in the mountains are like windows in a house, they let in the light from outside. In a year's time, the whole of the Eastern Caucasus will be partitioned by man-made roads in all directions. The crossings will be enclosed by small, close fortifications requiring only a few companies of garrison for the entire country. The Caucasus will be subdued because it will still be accessible in all its depths and from all sides. Moreover, the warlike population of the mountains will become their own security. The troops recruited from the natives served as faithfully as Russian troops. A fact that has long been known in the Caucasus, and they are much more effective than the latter for guarding peace in the mountains. The native squads, attracting to themselves the most determined youth, are endowed in the eyes of the mountain population, not only with material advantages, but also with great moral power, which they dare not oppose. These squads will form a link between the mountain tribes and the Russian power. As long and fierce war had developed the already bellicose spirit of the Caucasian tribes too much to not allow an outlet for it. There were too many people in the mountains accustomed to feeding themselves with weapons alone to leave them to starve without occupation. These very people, Kashags, Abreks, Brigands of all names who made the mountain region impassable for 100 kilometers around, having joined the mountain squads as hunters, will be faithful soldiers, as proven by the Dagestan Cavalry Regiment, the best police in the mountains. An excellent army for external warfare. To maintain tranquility in the mountains, settled and uncovered, would require very few troops. The Caucasus, which has hitherto absorbed half the active forces of the empire, will soon become a source of new strength for it. The conquest of the eastern mountains has abruptly changed the defensive and offensive position of the Caucasian army. From the present year, the isthmus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea has been forever secured to Russia. Whatever political combinations may take place in the neighbouring countries, wherever forces may be directed against the Caucasus, yet so far the empire has only secured possession of the isthmus. Much remains to be done to arrange it as it should be, so that it may be quite in harmony with the aims and endowments of the state. Only after a few years of strenuous effort with unrelenting means will it be possible to say it's ready. The first task to be accomplished in the Caucasus, a task which must be finished as soon as possible, is the conquest of the Western Mountains. With the fall of Shamil, the rear of the Caucasian army is secured and its scattered forces are gathered, but neither of these things is quite complete, as long as the Governor-General of Caucasus is separated from the Cuban line by a wide belt of unruly mountains, and as long as a considerable mass of troops is immovably confined to one part of the region. The mere possibility of fighting against the Russian Empire in whatever remote corner of the country the struggle may take place inevitably keeps the whole population in a state of anxiety and kindles hopes which would not otherwise exist. Such an example is all the more dangerous in a Muslim land. Besides the unruly Adaigs on our own the shore of the sea, which opens to them communication with the whole world, I do not at all share the opinion that the land of the Adaigs should be considered a gate into the heart of the Caucasus to be opened in the event of an enemy invasion. It is as difficult for allies to pass through this land as for enemies. Besides, volatile Ubiks or Shapsogs can only be one's allies for 3 days. Even without outside support, existence of an open enemy between the Kuban and Abkhazia is quite burdensome and dangerous. Now, with the fall of eastern mountains, the struggle in the Caucasus is morally resolved. The Adaigs cannot hold out against the active strength with the Caucasian army possesses for long, but only against such strength. Reducing the army before the country has been completely pacified would again prolong the matter in the Caucasus and ultimately cost much more for the resulting complexity than forceful short-term actions. If in 1816, with the appointment of General Yermolov to the Caucasus, several regiments returning from abroad were assigned to him, the empire would have avoided a 30-year war with Muradism and reduced its losses by hundreds of millions of rubles and hundreds of thousands of people. The western mountains must be conquered without delay, sparing no sacrifice. The second thing which is necessary for the Caucasus, both militarily and socially, for the army and for the region as a whole, is the construction of the Transcaucasian Railroad. I cannot develop this matter here, which has already been discussed by the authorities, as such a development would require another book of the same size, but I will outline its main features. If in the recent war the fate of the country was decided on the field of battle by 9 battalions, it was due as much to the absorption of our forces by Highland warfare as to the extreme slowness of communications, which compelled us to scatter our troops at all points where the enemy might appear. For we had no other way to get there in time. In the Caucasus, with the meandering outline of the border, which includes both land and sea, there are several lines leading straight from the circumference to the centre, lines the possession of which can strategically decide the fate of war. Food had to be procured long in advance, with the greatest difficulty. In accordance with the original disposition of the troops, which could not be changed afterward because of the impossibility of moving the stores, the troops were confined to their provision depots, even though military circumstances sometimes produced quite different needs, hence the fragmentation and weakness of the army, which on the whole was quite significant. In order to make the strength of Russian troops in Transcaucasia both defensively and offensively correspond to their actual number, it is necessary to cut through the region with a railway line from sea to sea. Then the Transcaucasian troops, which had been so far weak due to their fragmentation, will form one body capable of dealing an irresistible blow in any direction. With the rapid development of the Volga and Caspian shipping companies, Transcaucasia, connected into one entity by the railway, will become at all its points a 3-week journey to the main centres of the state, and thus become part of the general composition of the Russian regions. Instead of the numerous army which now, even in peacetime, has to be kept in this remote frontier region, Transcaucasia will only have to be heavily occupied in times of war. Like any other part of the frontier, requiring forces proportional to the actual danger, and not to any possible accident, as is currently the case when the mountains in this region is half a year's journey from the interior of Russia. The savings for the state will be enormous. Its power on the side of the Caucasian isthmus will triple, and at the same time, the Caucasian army will become mobile, like all the active troops of the empire. The railroad will have the same influence on the welfare of the country as irrigation has on fertile but sunburned soil. Until now, all the natural forces of Transcaucasia slept in the ground. The only consumer here was the treasury. The railroad will make these regions, which so far have brought nothing but expenses, an independent and wealthy part of the empire. Finally, the railway line from Baku to Poti, which crowns our position in the Caucasus, is economically much more secure than any of the Russian lines, which will have to excite and attract traffic that does not yet exist. The 25 million rubles worth of goods that annually flood Persia and all of the Upper Asia through Trabzon are only waiting for a convenient path through Transcaucasia and the Caspian Sea. At the present time, this trade is making its way through the most inhospitable country. The high mountainous area of Turkish Armenia, transported on pack animals and without roads, a railroad between the two seas will draw this trade to itself and double the quantity of goods, reducing their selling price. The cost of the railroad, according to the calculations already made, will only slightly exceed the cost of the Russian lines. The value of the cargo of the Trabzon trade should more than recoup this sum, even at high interest rates. This enterprise, necessary politically and militarily, is at the same time profitable economically. With the conquest of the Western Mountains and the establishment of a railroad between the Black and Caspian Seas, the Caucasian army will still become part of the active forces of the empire. Is it still impossible to determine even approximately how much this return of 200,000 soldiers, perhaps the first in the world, excluded so far from the total of Russian forces, will elevate the military power of the state? The incessant and merciless war has shaped several generations in the Caucasus, who are trained in the martial craft almost hereditarily. A new recruit, having joined a Caucasian regiment and having not yet seen the enemy, get used to the idea of war as a natural and everyday business of life. Having undertaken several campaigns, he develops personally, not only as a soldier but as a fighter. He continually meets the enemy one-on-one, on the forest trail, on the mountain path, in the besieged village, and gets used to relying on himself alone, on his nerve and his gun. When the column of these men forms, with each absolutely confident in himself, they become so convinced of their invincibility that only a disproportionate material force can resist them. We've seen enough examples of this in the past war. This kind of education was previously given only to the ancient armies, where every soldier was a fighter, and it was completely forgotten in the European armies from the moment when the duty of a soldier became only to march en masse behind his banner and listen to commands. A Caucasian soldier is like an officer in his own way. Russian valour needs a broad field. In peacetime, it's only in the Caucasus that arms rattle, beckoning men with military inclinations. Young officers whose hearts are attracted to the fighting life gradually flock to the Caucasus by themselves. The mountain more quickly develops their military instinct, makes a real leader out of an officer, one who is able to manage people and control battles. In the forest and in the mountains, no matter how numerous the detachment may be, the company commander becomes an isolated leader. He is left to conduct an almost independent business in which his character and disposition receive independent rights, and he becomes one of the causes of general success or failure. The responsibility for military decisions reaches much lower ranks in the Caucasus than in European warfare, and the men who are put before the daily reckoning of experience are sorted out by themselves. Moreover, special circumstances of life and actions had developed in the Caucasian regiments, the spirit of the military family, the pride in their regimental uniform and their banner, always justified by some high military quality which the regiment had acquired exclusively for itself. The relationship and mutual responsibility between people of all degrees flourished here more than any other army, and naturally installed in the individual full confidence in his unit, due to the ability to rely on each of its constituent people. Continuous campaigns hardened the Caucasian soldier, made him the greatest foot soldier in the world, taught him to live anywhere and with anything. The Caucasian War forms an army for Russia, which under its banner is ready to consider itself at home at the very edge of the world, which immediately understands every application of military affairs in which the enemy must exterminate in order to defeat. When the Caucasian battalion faces the enemy, it considers as a battle only the time it needs to run to the enemy's lines. This confidence is shared by all its ranks, from the commander to the drummer. In addition to the regular army, the Caucasian War has nurtured for Russia another excellent and unique force, the Linear and Black Sea Cossacks, equally capable of close formation and horsemanship, cavalry and infantry when used in large numbers. These men, fearless and indefatigable, vast as the wind, can carry out aspects of military affairs hitherto unheard of, blocking the enemy army in its own country, disuniting it, encircling it from the rear and flanks, breaking communication between separate columns. Until now, the Linear Cossacks had participated only as a part of the divisions in European warfare. Yet even there, they left a lasting impression. With the end of the Caucasian War, over 40,000 Cossacks could join the army. The remarkable army expresses aspects of the Russian nature that go I noticed in civilian life. The best line regiments were formed before our eyes, from villages to such an extent that the spirit of the Cossack still lives, if not in the mind then in the blood of the Russian man. In a few years, these villages placed on the enemy's border became the bravest and most dexterous horsemen, true abreks, superior to the Chechens, and at the same time obedient, fully disciplined soldiers capable of all kinds of service. So quickly did the military spirit develop in these villages that in a few years, a young woman, yesterday's peasant, would not want to say a kind word to a Cossack who was not considered a brave soldier. Russia, with its immense size, still lives the life of different centuries. In the Ukrainian lands, Caucasian, Siberian, Kyrgyz, Cossacks still exist in the same condition as they existed in the 16th century in the Dnieper and the Don. Simultaneously, warriors and villagers, Cossacks developed the land they occupied with arms in their hands, bring the Russian fatherland into foreign deserts, and should be for the empire what American pioneers are for the United States. In the Caucasus, it would have been impossible to deal with the mountaineers without the settlement of the front lines by Cossacks. Before long, the Caucasian Cossack regiments will be advanced further ahead, and the Cossack population, reinforced by newcomers, will increase considerably. They're not 40, but maybe 70,000 Caucasian Cossacks could be ready to take up their banners at the first call of the fatherland. The third element of the new strength that the conquered Caucasus lends to the empire lies in the mountain troops. Under the system now adopted, their number can be great, and their quality cannot be doubted. There can be no better troops than the Dagestan Cavalry Regiment and the Anapa Squadron. For Caucasian mountaineers, battles and peril are essential as for the ancient Scandinavians. It is only necessary to provide the right outlet for their warlike nature, and then the Caucasus can throw out of its depths the units which will surprise the world under Russian banners. The conquest of the Eastern Caucasus cost the empire great sacrifices. The conquest of the Western will cost still more, perhaps for some time, but this conquest will be accomplished in the shortest possible time, and the natural and personal forces of the country will be properly developed. In this you can trust the man whom the whole Caucasus and good judge of practical men trusted from the moment he stepped foot there. With the definitive pacification of the isthmus, this part of the Russian Empire will amply reward the state politically and militarily, and in parts even economically. The mere return of the Caucasian army to the total of our active forces and the cessation of fruitless sacrifices and ever-present apprehension over this country constitute a success of great importance. You may reasonably think that if the mountains had been pacified in 1853, the war would have taken a very different turn. Now at least this great deed has been accomplished. The fulfillment of the rest with the same strong administration can be calculated ahead with certainty. The establishment of the undisputed Russian rule on the Caucasian Isthmus, fully organized, will be a world event whose consequences will not be exhausted for several generations. At the present time, it is not yet possible to comprehend with human judgment all that may develop from the final conquest of the Caucasus. This bridge from the Russian shore into the heart of the Asiatic continent. The future is not within the power of man, but men have the power to be worthy of a great future. For the time being, as long as we are satisfied with what has been accomplished, we will say with Bogdan Khmelnytsky, what will be, and what will be God's will. Yeah, and that is the end of the 60-year Caucasian War. So thank you for everybody who stuck with me through these 3 streams. There's a comment from Iron Duke. Just what the British used to say about the northwestern frontier of India. Yes, I can definitely see the comparisons, it being the sort of the mountainous frontier and wild west of an empire. Perhaps we may have to do a stream on that on Suspended Isolation one day, Iron Duke. Right. I'm going to see if we've had any super chats. This is now people's opportunity to ask questions if they want to. Right. Okay, there's been no super chats on Entropy or on YouTube. All right. Well, what I'd recommend people do when the stream is over in about 15 minutes, my friend AI Shia Tori is going to be streaming. He's going to be reacting to a video Connor Tomlinson, formerly of the Lotus Eaters, has put out about a visit he made to a certain country in the Middle East. So I recommend you go and give AI a watch. And other than that, I do plan at some point in the future to go on Iron Duke's channel and, as part of his Splendid Isolation History series, do a stream on Richard Burton, the sort of Orientalist and Victorian soldier and explorer. Because other than Iron Duke mentioning him on X earlier today, I actually was reading the book Pax Britannica by James Morris, which is kind of this snapshot view of the British Empire, and he actually had a chapter on Richard Burton and some of the other explorers in Africa. So that was certainly interesting. So I'm not sure when that will be, but hopefully that will be the near future. So as there's been no questions, I'm going to wrap this up now. So thank you for watching, and good night.